From PoliticsPA, I'm Steve Ulrich. This is Voices of Reason. Today, we're here at the Capitol to discuss a number of relevant topics. Do you ever wonder why independent voters are not permitted to vote in a Pennsylvania primary? What's being done to have Pennsylvania join over 40 other states that do allow independent voting? Credit cards. They're ubiquitous today, and Pennsylvania legislators want to reduce what's known as swipe fees in an effort to support small businesses. We'll talk with a group that objects to that legislation and find out why. We'll also talk about NOL, net operating losses. Why is Pennsylvania one of only 2 states to cap small business at 40% when the federal cap is 80%? And why is this debate important to Pennsylvania's future? All this and more coming up on Voices of Reason. Now on Voices of Reason, we're pleased to be joined by the former CEO of the Committee of 70 and the current president of the BallotPA initiative, David Thornburgh. David, thanks very much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome, Steve. Good to be here.
For those who are unaware, could you talk about exactly what the BallotPA initiative is? As we do understand that Pennsylvania is one of the few states that does not allow independent voters in primary.
Yep. Well, that's the crux of the issue. There's 1.3 million independent voters who are shut out of primary elections. And we're trying to change that. And we've got bills in the House and the Senate. We've been working on this intensively for about 3 years. It's good policy. And this particularly I want to talk about today. This is good politics for both parties. So it's a critical issue. You know, it's about making sure that every registered voter can vote in every election. And if we don't believe that voters should have a say when it matters, we got big problems. So that's what we're trying to change.
My understanding is all 67 counties end up using taxpayer funds to pay for elections, and independent voters are paying for these primary elections but being excluded.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably the argument that cuts through the clutter most effectively. And some folks say this is taxation without representation. And it costs about $75 million a year to hold primary elections. 1.3 million voters literally are paying for a party they can't attend. And, some wise guy said, I believe we fought a revolution over a principle like that. So that's the fundamental wrong. I should also say that one of the things that fascinates me is a lot of veterans, like half of veterans, are independent voters. And the idea that we would lock out an independent veteran who served his or her country, put their lives on the line for this country, that we would lock them out of the voting booth is unconscionable to me. So that's another thing that brings people up short.
Well, certainly not only with veterans, but you're also talking about young people who maybe have not cast their lot with a Republican or a Democrat or another party as well. And then perhaps you look at different ethnic groups like Latinos.
Exactly. I mean, the national polling says 60% of young people, 18 to 25, are choosing not to register in one of the 2 big parties. And, I began my career as a social studies teacher way back when. So, I was all about teaching young folks about being citizens and the rights and responsibilities of citizens. And to say to them, on the one hand, you're really important to this country. And on the other hand, to say, because you've chosen this path politically, you can't participate. We're working at cross purposes. We want those folks to feel like full participants in our democracy, that they have a say. And that's another reason that this is so wrong.
Now, I understand there's been a lot of recent polling that shows that you have support for this, not only from, let's say, the far left, but also from the far right.
Yeah, this is an issue, again, that sort of cuts through the clutter. Overall, 75% of primary voters, people who vote in primaries, support this change. And it doesn't seem to break particularly on one side or the other. We have 85% of progressive Democrats to basically 70% of Trump Republicans. And everybody else is somewhere in between. So it is wildly popular with voters. Our challenge has been the last couple of years is working on the politics. And again, I want to talk more about that. But in terms of voters, in terms of media endorsements, pretty much every media outlet across the state, I think there's 23 now, have endorsed this. We have tons of supporters among prominent former office holders, most notably our former governors. 5 former governors, 3 R's and 2 D's, support this. So we've got a lot of good momentum, a lot of folks standing up for this issue, but we got to push it hard.
Now that there are 2 House bills and also a Senate bill currently sitting above us here at the Capitol, but doesn't seem to be getting off the table and getting in front of those that need to discuss it and call for a vote.
Yeah. Well, we'll acknowledge that Pennsylvania is not always embraced reform at the front of the line. It takes us a while for things to sink in. But here is the political argument, and we got to make political arguments about this as well as the policy arguments. We're in a very tight, competitive election year right now. The presidential election in Pennsylvania, the control of maybe the House, maybe the Senate, and independent voters will swing those tight elections. We know that from polling. We know that from the math. And here's what I would say to the Biden and Trump campaigns, to Matt Bradford, the majority leader, Brian Cutler, the minority leader. If you want to court those independent voters for the tight races in your chamber, there's nothing more than those independent voters want to hear than this: I support your right to vote in every election. End stop. So that to me is, you can call it kind of a new message, a secret weapon, or whatever it is. Sure, they have other interests, schools, crime, taxes, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want to, again, reach independent voters where they are, you say to them, I support your right to vote in every election.
So, as I understand, this is more about having unaffiliated voters be able to choose whichever party primary they would like to participate in. Is that correct?
That's right. I say to folks who, might take it to mean something else, this is not a free-for-all. It's not a nonpartisan primary, although there are states that do that. This is simply gives you, as an independent voter, and I'm an independent right now, the right to choose the primary in which you'd participate. So this is proven. And here's the thing: not only is this fair, but it creates better incentives for people to govern. Because if you're a candidate, from an early part of the process, you have to face more voters.
Right.
You have to face not just the extreme wings of the parties, but all those folks who are in the middle. And then when you get elected by them, you're much more inclined to listen to them. And that should make what goes on upstairs or in Washington or in county seats not only a lot more civil, but a lot more productive. And for all the folks that are concerned about our lack of ability to do anything these days, that seems to me like a really important message.
Was there anything you learned from a state like Colorado that can help Pennsylvania get across the finish line?
Yeah. The evidence is pretty clear. Since Colorado started this 6 or 7 years ago, turnout has skyrocketed. And again, we should want that. We want more people participating, raise their hands, and to be counted. We've also seen in Colorado that the number of people choosing to be independents has grown, which I treat as a good thing, because it injects more competition in those primary races. You can't just play to the cheap seats of the extremes. You got to talk to the folks in the box seats and general admission and the reserve seats and the bleachers. And I think, and look, if you follow politics, and I suspect you folks do, you look at the folks who get elected from Colorado these days: a Jared Polis as governor, a Michael Bennett as senator, a John Hickenlooper as senator. Those are folks who are maybe center left, maybe they're just centrist, but they're very well regarded. They get stuff done, and I think that's what Pennsylvanians about.
I know one question that I hear from a lot of friends, it turns into, if I am a member of one of the 2 primary parties And as Republicans, we're going to elect our representative. Why should someone who has openly made the decision not to be a Republican be allowed to cast a vote in to make that determination?
Well, there's a simple answer to that. You can choose candidates any way you want if you want to pay for them. You want to pick them out of a hat. You want to have a caucus, a convention. You want to do it by alphabetical order. Do whatever you want if you pay for them. If all of us are paying for them, all of us should be able to participate.
Could you see us getting to a point one day where maybe it's not a two-party question? You have your Republican, your Democrat. Could it be with independents being involved? Maybe you have a one ballot, get two candidates who advance to, for lack of a better phrase, the final.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, but again, I'm very conscious that, I was born and raised a Pittsburgh Steeler fan, and if there was anything the Steelers embraced on offense, it was 3 yards in a cloud of dust. You gain the ground that you can. So we get this done, see how it works, and then think about other ways. The story of how we vote is constantly changing, and that's the advantage we have of doing it, of setting those rules at the state level. You can look at a Colorado, you can look at a New Hampshire and see how they do it and learn from that. But I'll just take one step at a time. This is the most obvious fault, I think, in our current election. And by the way, if you polled people and you said, how are you feeling about the choices that you have these days? How are you feeling about the two parties?
Right.
You're not going to get a lot of support. Right. This election in particular is feeling like a forced march to nowhere. And unfortunately, that doesn't bring out the best in the electorate. But again, we'll get through this. But I'd suggest with a better set of rules like what we're suggesting, we can get to more competitive elections that prepare more candidates to actually govern.
Well, this is also important in education initiative, because if you're younger than my generation, you assume that we've had primaries forever, and primaries are still a fairly recent addition to the schedule.
Basically 100 years old. And at the time, the idea was we have to democratize the process. Too many backroom deals to pick candidates. At the time, legislators still pick senators. We stop doing that. Well, like any good experiment, you watch it play out, and often it causes another problem. When this law was passed in 1937, a mere 87 years ago, the percentage of independents was like 2-3%. Right. And now in some counties, it's getting close to 20%. So, things change, populations change, ideologies change, and it's about time that Pennsylvania reacts to that.
And especially since lately there are very few competitive races anymore. We're not seeing two Republican candidates, two Democratic candidates pop up in the primary. Yeah. The election's being determined in some counties in Pennsylvania during the primary.
Well, I'll say most. I mean, we went back and looked the last 20 years of legislative races, and essentially 80 to 85% of the time, those races are effectively determined in the primary election. So in other words, that means there was no opposition in the general, or there was only token opposition. So if you put that together with the fact that we lock out independents, you can't very well say, look, you can still vote in a general because your vote in the general is meaningless. And look, I know that well. I live in Philadelphia. I was a Republican for a good number of years. And then I got tired of my voice not counting. So I was a Democrat for a couple of cycles, and then I became an independent. And sometimes I switch because I don't want the system to take away my vote, but it's very frustrating. And, it's interesting. Philadelphia is a case in point. There are about 250,000 voters between independents and Republicans who have no say in an election. A 7-1 Democratic majority. And that's just wrong. It's just plain wrong. I mean, just leave it at that. So then there are plenty of places like that. The rural areas where the numbers are reversed.
I have friends and colleagues that would register with the majority party just so they can have an impact on the primary.
I mean, here's the thing. We're all about encouraging people to vote. People want their votes to matter. And this is a way to allow more votes to matter in important elections.
Let's get you out of here on this one. We use that yards in a cloud of dust analogy. This being such an important election year, can you see this getting to the finish line before we reach, let's say, Labor Day, so it could be put into effect? Or is this something that's going to have to be perhaps kicked down the road another year?
Well, this will, whatever happens this year, it wouldn't go into effect until at least next year. But here again is what I would say to House leadership trying to either sustain or to a majority or flip the majority. If you're talking about seats in the Southeast, like a Joe Hogan, the Republican, or Missy Serrato, the Democrat, these are races that were decided by a few hundred votes. And in those House districts are 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 independent voters. You're going to need those in November. And again, the best calling card for an independent voter, we had a big rally out in Fort Washington a while ago. And two times the crowds broke out of independent voters. The crowds broke out into a simple chant, let us vote, let us vote, let us vote. So that's the message to those candidates, to those leaders. If you want those voters to help you win your race, tell them that you support their right to vote in every election. And again, I'd say that to the Trump and Biden campaigns, the last two presidential races, if you look at the exit polls, were decided by independent voters. So not rocket science, it's just math. And if you want to win the math, this is one way to do it.
Our thanks to the president of the BallotPA initiative, David Thornburgh, for joining us today on Voices of Reason. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Steve.
Welcome back to Voices of Reason. Credit cards. Everyone has one. Everyone probably has them loaded into their phone. You understand that when you use your credit card, that there is a fee that goes along with it, what is called a swipe fee. But did you know that right now there is a push, not only in Harrisburg, to eliminate that swipe fee, but there's also a battle against that. We're pleased to be joined by Kevin Shivers, the CEO of the Pennsylvania Association of Community Bankers, and Christina Mahalik, the Senior Vice President of Government Relations with the Cross-State Credit Union Association. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you explain a little bit about the swipe fee and what exactly it is? Not exactly where it's going right now, but what it is, to make sure people understand.
Sure, if I may, I'd like to talk about the electronic payment system. For those of you at home, I think of the electronic payment system like the monorail at Disney World, where you're going to the parking lots, you're going to the parks, the hotels, and you're using that payment system, the monorail, to travel around to get from one place to the other. Very simple a way to think about the payment system. So when you're at your retailer and the minute you take your card and you either tap it or you dip it or you swipe it, there's a transaction that takes place. It's actually moving around the rails to the customer's bank account. That money is then withdrawn and taken all the way over to the retailer's bank account where it's deposited. All of that happens in the blink of an eye. Now, there is a portion of this transaction. You think about the monorail at Disney World and, you think about the rails, the concrete structure, the trains, the conductors. There's a lot that allows for that transportation system to move around. The same thing with our electronic payment system. Now, as a community banking organization, and my colleague Christina, who represents the credit unions, think of us as as card issuers. We are the ones that allow the customers to be able to get on and off this payment system, this rail system of the electronic payment system. So we charge a fee. It's called the interchange fee that enables this system to be able to work, to get that payment from that customer's card to the bank account of the retailer. And all of this happens at the blink of an eye. It's safe, it's secure, and it's very efficient.
And if I can just add, from a financial institution's operational standpoint, interchange, also known as swipe fees, really cover the essential card services like fraud prevention and protection, card statements, card issuance, monitoring, customer service, and rewards that benefit consumers and Main Street businesses.
So, two Pennsylvania legislators, Representative Greg Scott and Representative Steve Samuelson, have introduced House Bill 2394, which is essentially prohibiting swipe fees from being applied to the sales and use tax portion of the transaction. Can you explain to me what that means in layman's terms?
All right. It's complex, I know that, but the legislation, what that means for Pennsylvanians means credit and debit cards will no longer be the simple and fast way to pay in Pennsylvania. If this new legislation is passed, that would completely upend the way electronic payments work, as Kevin alluded to.
So think about it when we have to pay our taxes every year, right? So we actually will pay our taxes, we'll put it in the mailbox, and it goes back to the government. What the advocates for this legislation are trying to say is that we're talking about a fee that's being applied to the payment of a tax. Well, that's like when we put that tax bill check in the mail, that we're going to stiff the U.S. Postal Service a portion for the cost of putting that in the mail. It just doesn't make sense. There's a cost to running the system to administer the safe, secure, convenient, efficient way of conducting these kinds of electronic transactions. Unfortunately, some of the biggest box stores, they don't want to pay that.
And I think that's one of the questions. I think proponents of the legislation say we're going to help the small businesses, the small coffee shops, the small shops that make up your local downtown, but not necessarily seen that way from your side, I guess.
From a small business standpoint, it's definitely going to add cost and accounting nightmares for small businesses, based on the infrastructure that's going to be required with the legislation of separating that tax from the transaction price. It's investing in new technologies. And also, as small credit unions and small community banks, has also a significant stress on them as well.
These merchant payment systems, and all of us know them. It's the little box where either you're dipping, you're tapping, or you're swiping. And there's a lot of technology that goes behind that system. And that system, all it looks at when a payment goes along the payment rails, it only looks at the total amount. It doesn't break out any portion of that payment that is for certain products or other products. And really, there are significant privacy questions here, because if this legislation, God forbid, were ever enacted, literally it's going to allow government to look inside the consumer shopping cart to decide which of these products were subject to sales tax, which were not. That's a level of privacy that I think a lot of people have concern about. So it is a little bit disturbing, but the cost to small business is going to be significant. There are a lot of small businesses that simply can't afford in this environment to upgrade their technology. Right. So many of them may choose to simply not accept credit cards or debit cards for their payment system. Well, when you look at consumers who have now grown accustomed to using this type of convenient payment system, that may mean that those customers might leave those small businesses in favor of a big box store who has the financial wherewithal to be able to upgrade their technology rather easily and efficiently.
Doyle, sorry, please go ahead.
Just go back to the privacy issue. In addition, really digging into looking at consumers' shopping behavior, we're also concerned about how that information is being transferred from that small business box store business to the processor. So that's why we have the beauty of the electronic payment system, where it's safe and secure. We capture just that purchase price, and interchange goes from there. But with this, you're having two different transactions, one in a safe, secure payment, but also what happens in that capacity for the data exchange, putting consumers' information at risk.
So for a merchant, there's some thought that perhaps they're actually going to be improving their bottom line by eliminating this fee. Am I reading that correctly?
Well, if you're a big box store, this is going to be a boon to you. I mean, the biggest box stores, according to research by the Electronic Payments Association, they stand to make $250,000. I believe that's a month, Christina, whereas the typical small business may only see a few $100s of savings every month. But that doesn't take into consideration the actual cost of the new payment system that these small businesses now are going to need to deploy in their retail establishments. So the short-term gain is going to be offset by the long-term cost of these new electronic payment systems, which haven't yet been invented.
And takes time. As you saw how we went from swipe to chip,
Right.
to, the beep, I like to say, it takes years, and the sophistication that comes with that technology, is troubling.
Well, for banking industry, credit unions, don't you also have the cost of issuing cards,
Hmm.
providing customer service, credit card fraud, and other
Exactly.
services like that? And wouldn't that be impacted as well?
Absolutely. I mean, when you're taking a look at the credit unions and the banking system, we're the providers, the issuers of those cards, but we also are responsible for, the access to the payment system. And there's an administrative cost to that. When a consumer has a problem with their credit card or they suspect fraud and they call the number on the back, they're actually calling a bank or a credit union to handle that question. There's also the administrative burdens that go into making sure that transactions have occurred properly. So there is a significant cost that goes into that. So when you think about a transaction on our payment system, for every dollar that's moving around that system, what the big box retailers are saying is, you know what, we're only going to pay you 97 cents. Well, that means that the credit unions and the banks and community banks in particular are burdened by this. They're going to have to cover the cost of that system. Well, that means there's less resources to do other things that our communities rely on our banks to do and our credit unions to do. That could be less available money for lending, economic development in their community. That also could mean fewer available dollars for charitable investments in a community, and not to mention the systemic risk that this could cause to the entire electronic payment system here in Pennsylvania.
And just to add on the community level financial institution with credit unions in Pennsylvania, the majority of them are located in low income designated areas. So when you start dismantling the interchange system, the credit unions and community banks need to redirect resources, financial resources, to cover those voids. So the concern we have in these communities is the lack of access to credit. That could be a potential problem, particularly for those that are unbanked or underbanked. And our mission is to serve. So it's shifting one area of responsibility from an industry standard to another industry with really no benefit to the consumer whatsoever.
Is this something that has happened in other states? Have you learned from it, or is this something that's popped up into first trial balloon? I guess it's Pennsylvania.
You want to take that one?
Well, unfortunately the advocates are searching for their first win. This has been proposed in dozens of states. It's been rejected in dozens of states. Most recently, though, a bill did get passed in the state of Illinois, and now that state, it sounds like their public officials are having buyer's remorse. The expectation was that this was going to somehow be a big benefit to consumers, small businesses, and retailers. Now the politicians in that state are having second thoughts about the decision they made in the process that they used to pass this. We'd like to avoid that type of circumstance here in Pennsylvania. So that's why the credit unions, the community banks, the large banks in Pennsylvania have been reaching out to lawmakers and consumers and small businesses all across Pennsylvania to educate the public about this piece of legislation, about this concept, to explain that it's not as simple as avoiding a fee to pay a tax, that this is actually going to forever shape and affect and shock the electronic payment system as we know it. It's going to take a very safe, convenient, and efficient electronic payment system, and it's going to make that cumbersome. It's going to risk the privacy of the consumers who use that system. It may even make the payment system more inconvenient for people who are using it. We've heard just as examples of how businesses might implement this new law, if God forbid it were enacted. There may be a transaction where the customer will purchase a payment and then use their credit card or debit card, and they'll swipe, they'll tap, or they'll dip for the actual transaction. Then the merchant will look at that customer and say, well, please pull out your wallet and pull out the change to pay for the sales tax. Well, that's not good for anyone. So now we're forcing 2 transactions on the consumer instead of 1. That doesn't make sense to me, and I don't think it makes sense to most Pennsylvanians when they're looking at what their future is going to be. The other solution could very well be that all of the players that are involved in this electronic payment system may simply just come up with another fee, because that cost has to be absorbed somewhere. So instead of this interchange fee, it could be called something else. But it's really disturbing to think that you have a system that's the envy of the Western world, all of the world for that matter, in terms of providing safe and convenient and efficient payment transactions. We're using them online, we're using them in person. To think that we're going to dismantle that system and disrupt the convenience of our electronic payment system.
And I think, just to add to that, all great points, Kevin, it's also the lack of accountability that you find in this legislation too. There's just a lot of gray areas of uncertainty, and uncertainty is never good for anybody, for the consumer, small businesses, particularly in today's, operating environment that we're facing still challenges. So just wanted to add that.
Well, I'm trying to imagine what life would be like taking change out of a change cup. When you said the merchant says you have to now pay for the sales tax. Well, I used the credit card, so I didn't have to do this. I don't have cash with me. Do I have to tap again, or do I steal out of the cup? So
that's exactly right. Now, I mean, we are literally in uncharted territory where this has never happened before. There again, there are bigger brains and minds that are part of how we're going to do this. But at the end of the day, the risk associated to the system by coming up with a plan that nobody thinks will be convenient, because the simplest method could be 2 transactions. I dare say a larger concern would be now the payment system is going to be looking within our shopping cart at the individual products that we purchase. So even when you think about it, if you go out to dinner, the payment system is going to know that you had 3 drinks instead of, just knowing the cost of the bill. That should be really disturbing to all of us that value privacy in our world. So,
and also, I think the likelihood of fraud increasing with this type of new reporting system that we don't know what will look like, but we kind of have an idea of what it would look like. It's just more, there's just more opportunities for fraud, because you have that total purchase price and then extracting that from their receipts and that private information and transmitting it. It's concerning.
So I think proponents of the legislation will always say, well, we're helping out the little guy. We're helping the small business on Main Street, and isn't that a good thing? But it sounds to me like the winners would be the mega stores more than
big box stores.
Small business.
Well, one of the arguments that was made during a public hearing back in December was that there has been an extraordinary increase in the amount of interchange paid by retailers, and in particular small business retailers, since the pandemic. And that's absolutely a true statement, right? Because we've been paying for more items using credit cards and debit cards. So naturally, the cost of interchange is going to go up, but that's as a result of the sheer number of transactions that have occurred. That's not a bad thing. If you think about it, for those retail establishments, those merchants are benefiting from the fact that they don't no longer have somebody at the cash register who's counting the money or collecting the checks. And for those merchants, they have the convenience and the security of knowing that their payment actually took effect in the blink of an eye. So no longer do we have to worry, is that check going to clear? No longer do we have to worry if a storekeeper actually miscounts the cash that's in their register. We have the convenience of knowing that a transaction happened and it was for a specific price, and that money moved from one bank account to the other, all of that within virtually a blink of an eye. And that's what makes the system so convenient. Our concern is now with this legislation, we're going to disrupt all of that convenience, all of that security, all of that safety to those individual small employers who benefited from being able to redeploy their staffs to go and work in other parts of the business, maybe going into sales and marketing, maybe going into customer service. They're going to need to bring those people back in to manage the cumbersome new payment system that is going to be designed to be able to keep up with this bifurcated transaction that's looming in the future.
And I think just to also add, just the competitiveness of Pennsylvania, if this is enacted, if I was an out of state small business, I probably might not want to invest, in Pennsylvania just because of the haphazard of all of the payment channels that we have to institute, if it's separating tax from just a general transaction, the concern of transferring data, privacy issues. It's a non-starter, I would say.
One of the challenges I think that you have in the last few days of a legislative session with budget hanging over Pennsylvanians' heads are what other things might be slipped in at the last moment. Is that one of the big fears right now, is what might appear in this next week?
I think not only is it what might be slipped in, I think the concern is a lack of understanding of really what we're talking about. And I think there was a great disservice done by the advocates for this legislation who last December presented this really as a fight between the retailers and the credit card companies, and argued that this was a way of just recovering a little bit of the profit making by the credit card companies. And nothing could be further from the truth. When we learned about this legislation literally days before a voting meeting, which thankfully the chairman of the committee, Steve Samuelson, allowed to become a public hearing, where the banks and the credit unions came forward and talked about the significant financial impact to Pennsylvania's credit unions, community banks, and banks overall, and what role we play in this electronic payment system. So there was a real education opportunity for us to be able to come forward, and I think that slowed down the progress to that point. But there was very limited fact finding that occurred since that time. And as a result, our concern is this legislation that literally was introduced last week. Within hours of its introduction, there was a vote called on it. So there was very little time to actually consider the legislation and its implications. That's what really concerns me. When you're taking a look at an electronic payment system that literally is responsible for billions of dollars in commerce every year, and you're thinking about, we're going to significantly alter this forever, lawmakers should give pause to that process and to really understand the dynamic economic consequences of changing the system, because the people that are going to be harmed the most are the consumers and the small business owners who rely on that system for payments. A lot of small businesses have been able to find equal footing with the big boxes with their online presence. So if you have a really catchy website and you have a convenient way for your consumers to reach your consumers and to entice them to buy things from you, that's really helping create a more level playing field for those small businesses with their big box store competitors. And you know what? Small businesses love competition. They thrive on it. And so now we're creating a system that could destabilize that system, because all we've talked about in this moment thus far are the transactions that are occurring at the register, where the merchant then says, pull out the change and pay for this. How are we going to do that with an electronic payment? So now if you're making an online purchase and you can only use the credit card for a specific purchase of a product, but you need another method for the sales tax that goes along with that, how are we capturing that information? Our concern is that this is a serious point for policymakers to really digest and understand before we move forward. The last thing we want to see is for Pennsylvania to make the same mistake that the state of Illinois recently made, and they're dealing right now with the buyer's remorse of having to figure out how are they going to manage the system and the new law that they created.
I'll give you the last word. Our thanks to Kevin Shivers. He's the president of the Pennsylvania Association of Community Bankers, and to Christina Mahalik, the senior vice president of government relations for the Cross-State Credit Union Association. Thank you both for joining us on Voices of Reason.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now on Voices of Reason, we're pleased to be joined by the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, Luke Bernstein. Luke, thank you very much for joining us today. And I want to start with something that hopefully you can explain. NOL, number one, and why is Pennsylvania tied for 49th in NOL?
Steve, it's great to be with you. And that is not a place you want to be, especially when you're looking at 50 total states and we are dead last, right? That's not a place that you want to be. So NOL, I call it nutter opportunity lost, but it's actually net operating losses. So what happens is when a company starts out or when they're operating, if they lose more money than they would make in any given year, they would have a net loss. They'd have a net operating loss. And so in Pennsylvania, we currently rank, as you astutely noted, last in the country, tied with New Hampshire, because states and the federal government allow these businesses to deduct those losses from their gains into future years. So it might take a business that's starting up a really long time to turn a profit. So if you're a business that you're investing in capital or you're going to have staffing needs, any type of operating expenses, you're probably going to have a loss when you start out. And we want businesses and encourage them with our tax policies to invest and grow so they can do that. But in Pennsylvania, because of our policy, so when I say we were tied for last, it is Pennsylvania and New Hampshire that are ranked last, because in the federal government tax policy, you are allowed to write off 80% of your net operating losses. In many other states, you are uncapped. So in 25 states, you're uncapped. In 19 other states, you are at the federal threshold of 80%. In 4 states, we don't have a C&I. And so there's two under 80%, Pennsylvania and New Hampshire, and we are tied for dead last in that area. So we think we need to change that policy.
It certainly begs the question, if the federal cap is 80%, and there are a lot of states that have no cap, why is Pennsylvania stuck at 40%?
Seems pretty logical. And that's a place where I think we can at least strive to go. So Senator Rothman has a bill right now in the Senate, and that bill would allow net operating losses to reach that federal cap of 80% over a period of time. So it would gradually increase it by 10% a year. So go to 50, 60, 70, and then 80% and lock in there moving forward. Would we love this to be uncapped? We would. But getting to the federal threshold at least allows us to be competitive with the majority of other states. Actually, not even the majority, but 19 other states in the country. You take the 4 out. So it's a real opportunity for us to address competitiveness. And let's face facts. In today's global economy, states are competing for companies. States are competing for jobs. So in Pennsylvania, with the border state situation, we have New York to our north, we have Ohio to our west, we have West Virginia, we have Maryland, we have Delaware, we have New Jersey. And when you look at all these areas, companies are looking to say, where am I going to make my next investment, or where am I going to choose to open? So if you're on the border of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and in New Jersey, you automatically think, well, they have a higher corporate net income tax. But when you really break it down and look at the net operating losses and the cap, you would be wise, if you're going to have some losses, to take a good hard look at New Jersey's tax policy over Pennsylvania, which is not a place that we should be. So this really levels the playing field with our competitive states that we compete with every day.
So when you hear Governor Shapiro has been very vocal about sick and tired of losing to, I believe the word is friggin', Ohio.
It's a technical term.
It is a technical term. So this is exactly what you're talking about, right?
It's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah. So Ohio, which does not have a C&I, and so with their net operating losses, as they're looking at like Intel, so when Intel is looking to make their next big investment, Pennsylvania's corporate net income tax was 9.99. It was a giant stop sign for Intel. So why does that really matter? Because when you take a high C&I like Pennsylvania has, and we worked in a bipartisan manner to actually lower that, cut it in half over 9 years. So it's going from 9.99 to 4.99. But when you take a high C&I and you couple it with NOLs and you cap it there, it makes the C&I even more punitive of the rate, because you can't take any of those gains that you might have against current or past losses. So it is essentially a hard cap on investment. And so it does not allow these businesses to invest in Pennsylvania. So how do we beat friggin' Ohio? We change our tax policy. That's how we beat friggin' Ohio. And we start looking at things that are going to get incentivize companies to invest more. And I hear, Steve, all the time, well, they had a better incentive, or they're throwing all this incentives to come here. If we could just level the playing field and allow businesses in the private sector to do what they do best, and that's grow and invest in areas where they feel they can, allowing them to take money that they already have and invest in them. Companies in Pennsylvania want to invest more into Pennsylvania. It is easier. It is more scalable. They're set up to do that here. And if we give them the tools to do that, they'll do it. If we give them incentives not to do it, they will not do it. And that's an opportunity for us.
So don't all politicians basically campaign on more jobs, increasing business in the Commonwealth? What's the sticking point? What, from a layperson's view, what am I missing here? Because everything you're saying seems to make a lot of sense.
I think one of the sticking points is today, and I think we have to do a really effective job as we look forward. The budget in Pennsylvania is done on what is a static budget. So they look at numbers in and out. There's no dynamic scoring or dynamic modeling. So I constantly hear, well, NOLs, net operating losses, there's a cost to that. It is not a cost. It is an investment. It's an investment in change in the future. We have done the same thing in Pennsylvania over and over. And how has that worked out in terms of demographics? It has not worked out well. We have lost a congressional seat every census going back the last 10 censuses, 100 years, where we had at one point, as you know, well over 30 congressional representatives, and now we're down to 17. So what can we do to change that dynamic? We can change our tax policy. We can invest into changing that to allow companies to grow here. So when we think about this as the sticking point to your question, we need to change people's thought from it's a cost to an investment. And it's not even a significant investment in the grand scheme of everything else that we're looking at, but it's an important investment to companies that could utilize those funds, especially early on, to grow. The other factor is it is a startup penalty. So it penalizes startup businesses that want to grow here, that are saying, if you look at Carnegie Mellon, for example, one of the innovation institutions, one of the leading innovation institutions in the world right now, is set up right in southwestern Pennsylvania. And from an incubation standpoint, they are having all of these incredible innovative companies starting and growing from their infancy right at Carnegie Mellon. Where would you grow? Where would you start? Because they're competing with the rest of the world. And 93% of students right now at Carnegie Mellon are not from Pennsylvania. So when they look to start right out of there to start their business, we should be the first place, the most attractive place where they can start that business.
And not only Carnegie Mellon, but there are so many great institutions of higher learning in the Commonwealth that incubators like this would make sense.
Yeah, people talk about North Carolina having a research triangle. Forget North Carolina. Pennsylvania has a research rectangle. Look at our state. Every corner of our Commonwealth has incredible centers of higher education. And your background is head of the Centennial Conference. When you look at it, and you look in southwestern part of the state, we have Pitt, we have Carnegie Mellon, we have all these different schools. Robert Morris. I could keep going on. Slippery Rock. You start going up Slippery Rock. You go to Gannon. You look at all the different places. Mercyhurst in the Northwest. In the central part, I say obviously Penn State with a presence all over the state. In the southern, you Juniata we talked about. We have Dickinson. We have Bucknell. We have Franklin and Marshall. Going to the northeastern part of the state with Scranton, and coming straight down where you've got Moravian and Lehigh and Lafayette, and all the way like down in the southeast where you have Penn and Temple and Drexel and Villanova and St. Joe's, and you could go on and on and on. The biggest way we can change our demographic tide in Pennsylvania is twofold. Number one, it's through jobs, and number two, it's utilizing our centers of education as attraction points to import talent instead of exporting talent. And so it is a way to attract new people into the Commonwealth and to stay here and create their own jobs. And by the way, I mentioned a lot of schools. We aren't even scratching the surface of Thaddeus Stevens and other community college Pennsylvania. We're not even scratching the surface of the potential that and the grand scale of schools that we have in this state. And we are blessed. That is, when you look at site selection for companies, Steve, every company that we talk to that is thinking about, should I come to Pennsylvania? Should I go to another state? They all look things a little bit different, but many of them have the same core areas on their board. Many of them are talking about what different types of energy costs and resources they are. They're talking about infrastructure. They're all talking about workforce. They're talking about tax policy. But as big part of that workforce is higher education and the opportunity to recruit that local talent and where they can have that talent sourced, either insourced or outsourced, if they're going to have to bring them in and go there. And that is a strategic advantage we have here in Pennsylvania that very few states have.
Well, you mentioned early on about Pennsylvania missed out an opportunity with Intel.
Yep.
I believe Tesla is also looking at Pennsylvania.
Yep.
And
Yep.
losing to Nevada.
Yep.
Are there other examples that people should know about?
Yeah, so those are the two big ones that you look at, because you think about the long-term generational opportunities that have been lost. Let me give you another one that is not NOL related, but it was permitting related. U.S. Steel was looking to build their next facility. Pittsburgh would have been the logical place, which is where they were headquartered, where they're headquartered now, where they wanted to build and get scale there. Because of the permitting challenges in Pennsylvania, they decided to look elsewhere and ultimately went to Arkansas. They took this $3 billion facility to Arkansas, where it's 1,000 jobs at over $100,000 in average salary. And that is not even including the construction jobs and all the downstream economic impacts. And at the time, the governor of Arkansas, Hutchinson, said the dreaded phrase, "We cut the ribbon in Arkansas before they would have even gotten a permit to break ground in Pennsylvania." And if that's not a wake-up call, it certainly should be. And so that's a big problem. But there are countless examples of companies. Fairlife is another one that chose New York over us. We're looking at data centers. You're looking at the CHIPS Act. Right now, we can be a leader because of our energy and power sources here in Pennsylvania, and we shouldn't lose companies because of our net operating loss provisions.
I struggle as I listen to you explain all this. It certainly makes perfect sense. It begs the question, as we sit here in the rotunda, why can't we get our legislators moving in a positive direction?
And we have to. And let's face it, legislators come from all different backgrounds of the state. And so when they go to town hall meetings, I understand they're probably not hearing from their constituents in mass. I want to hear about NOLs. It's a complicated issue. But when you sit down, you have an opportunity to explain it. Most people say that makes a lot of sense. And you can see that. So in the Senate, the bill was passed unanimously in the Senate Finance Committee. It was passed when it was a standalone bill in the House with over 160 votes. So in today's political climate, when you can get that, so over 160 out of 203 and unanimously in the Senate Finance Committee, clearly there's bipartisan consensus that this is a problem, it's a challenge, it needs to be addressed. But the reality is not a lot of things have gotten addressed in this legislative session. So I think if there's a tax bill coming up, there's an opportunity to fix this problem once and for all, and to at least get it on the train that could finally move. So when you're looking at what are the obstacles of coming here, we can remove a big one. But we're in a very polarized environment. Pennsylvania is currently the only state in the country, you've heard the governor talk about this, with a full-time divided legislature, but there are certain things that just make so much sense. And the other piece, it's just unacceptable not to address one of the biggest obstacles to getting companies not only to come to Pennsylvania, but the companies that are here to grow and invest, and the companies that want to start here to say, we don't want you here. We're going to put a startup penalty in place. And that is what this is. So it's a unique opportunity in a polarized environment to actually bring people together. So we're hopeful within this legislative session that we can do that.
With 5 days remaining to try to get the budget done, although I understand that they're going to be here through Sunday voting as well, oftentimes you see things kind of slid in at the last moment.
Yep.
Is that something we could see Senator Rothman's bill perhaps getting a fair hearing here in the next few days, or do you see it getting kicked down the road perhaps to the end of the legislative session?
Well, the good news is this is one that it's been not under the radar. It's been talked about in the Senate. Obviously had a hearing in the Senate and passed through there. It's one that had a hearing in the House already and passed through as part of a larger bill, which on the whole bill in the House tax package, we didn't like a lot of the pieces in it. And there were challenges in as a bill in total, but there were a lot of pieces in it we did like. And so, but each of the pieces have been talked about and discussed on its merit. So this is one as a standalone that I think has proven it has a lot of different support. So I think, I'm not one that thinks the budget will pass in 5 days. I think we will be in a little bit of overtime situation again this year. And, people ask all the time, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I would rather see a good budget done than a bad budget done on time. And so if NOLs can be a part of it, that's a step in the right direction. There is, I think, so much consensus around this issue. It should not be controversial, but it needs to be a priority. And as you know, a budget is a list of your caucuses and collective priorities is how it comes together. So we're hopeful it will be. And this is one of many issues as you look in the priorities that could actually make a real difference. And it also sends a real strong signal to companies in other states coming off the C&I reduction that Pennsylvania is interested about having us here, wants to grow here. And you can see these different pieces moving together, working in tandem to send that signal. It'll be much stronger if they're going together.
How important this is to Pennsylvania's economic future. Are you willing to take little steps to get there, or does this need to be something that we need maybe to get 3/4 or all of it at one time?
In my experience, I would say perfect is the enemy of progress. Perfect is the enemy of good. I think even coming out of Senator Rothman's bill, that's a phase-in. There are resources in the funds right now. People often talk about, we talk about a structural deficit, we talk about whether it be ARPA funding, surplus funding. We should not fundamentally, philosophically, I do not think we should be spending one-time revenue on recurring expenses. So is there revenue right now that could take the cap from 40 to 80? Yes, that would be just over $300 million. So it would not be a significant amount of money in terms of the overall budget picture. Obviously, that's a lot of money. But from an investment standpoint, this you would start seeing generating returns. You would also start seeing movement through the private sector of reinvestment into the community, reinvestment, because you have to think about this. You actually have to have the gains for this to even apply. So you actually have to have economic profits for you had, in future years have lost to offset. So this is a good thing. We should be trying to encourage companies to have profits so they could utilize those losses, or if they're thinking about creating a plant, opening a plant, if they're thinking about opening another office, if they're thinking about hiring 2, 3, 4, 5 more people, this gives them that incentive to do it. I would love to have it happen overnight, but with a 4-year glide path, essentially, it allows you to plan for that time. So if you want to spend a lot of money this year and take those losses in future years, you can certainly do that. And that's why I think that's an important piece of this overall budget.
Our thanks to the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, Luke Bernstein, for joining us on Voices of Reason. And that does it for today's edition of Voices of Reason. Our thanks to guests David Thornburgh, Kevin Shivers, Christina Mahalik, and Luke Bernstein for joining us. From PoliticsPA, I'm Steve Ulrich.